Caleb fought for justice, but he never thought that his own friends would start hating him for it. And when the school teacher who humiliated him suddenly disappeared, everything took an even darker turn. Accusations, threats, and even an attack on his home. That was only the beginning. The most shocking twist? Caleb was offered a scholarship that could change his life, but his choice in response destroyed everything around him. What made him stay and take a step that left everyone speechless? Let's find out. Caleb sat in his usual seat by the window, staring at the board, but his thoughts were far away. He liked math, the purity of numbers, the logic of solutions where there was no room for bias. However, this time, the feeling of calm was shattered by Mr. Riley's unexpected and sharp remark. The white teacher interrupted the lesson, looked around the class, and said, as if in passing, "It's amazing how some people get such high grades, especially those who use special privileges." All eyes instantly turned to Caleb. He felt the blood rush to his face, and a hot wave of resentment hit his chest. His hands clenched into fists under the desk, and only one thought flashed in his mind. This is about me. Caleb didn't know how to respond. A battle ignited inside him. Should he speak up now, raise his voice against the obvious insult, or silently endure it? His silence filled the room with a heavy atmosphere. His classmates giggled, casting quick glances at Caleb, as if waiting for his reaction. Does anyone have any thoughts on how that might happen? Mr. Riley continued, his eyes sliding over Caleb as if to emphasize his words. Caleb felt his breathing quicken, and one thought echoed in his mind. Why? Why is he doing this? He knew the answer. The answer lay in the color of his skin. This wasn't an innocent joke or a casual remark. It was the embodiment of racism that he had felt too often in his life, but which had never been so blatantly displayed at school. For the rest of the lesson, Caleb struggled to keep his emotions in check, but his inner world was crumbling. His talent and hard work were being questioned by one remark, one stroke of the teacher's authority. The resentment slowly grew into anger, and along with it came the understanding that this couldn't continue. He had to do something. Later that evening, Caleb sat at the kitchen table while his mother prepared dinner. He was silent, watching her deftly handle the knife and pots, trying to find the words to explain what had happened. He feared his story would seem too insignificant to raise a fuss, but deep inside he knew. This was more than just an unpleasant comment. It was an act of injustice, systemic racism that he could no longer ignore. "Mom, today in class Mr. Riley said something that really upset me," he began, his voice trembling with suppressed emotions. His mother, sensing the change in her son's tone, froze and looked at him, her face tightening with concern. What exactly did he say? Her voice was soft but demanding. Caleb took a deep breath and told her what had happened. As he spoke, the feeling of injustice inside him grew. He expected his mother to get angry, but she remained calm, though a dark cloud of worry appeared in her eyes. "You know, Caleb, in life you'll face this kind of attitude many times," she began slowly, choosing her words carefully. "But the important thing isn't what they say. It's what you do about it. You know who you are. You know what you're capable of, and no one has the right to question that." Caleb thought about it. It hurt him that he had to prove his worth just because his skin was a different color. But how do I fight this? He continued to wonder. "Maybe I should talk to the principal," he suggested uncertainly. "But what if nothing changes?" His mother slowly shook her head. "If you do nothing, nothing will definitely change. But sometimes, one drop can start a whole tsunami. You have to decide what to do, but remember, the fight for justice is a long road. Are you ready for it?" Caleb realized that his doubts were not because he feared the consequences, but because he knew obstacles lay ahead. Making the decision meant confronting those who didn't believe in equality, and he wasn't sure he had the strength. The next morning, Caleb stood in front of the principal's door. An inner voice still urged him to retreat, to the safety of silence. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe I'm blowing this out of proportion, he thought. But then his mother's words echoed in his memory. The fight for justice is a long road. He opened the door and walked into the office. Mr. Wilson, I need to talk to you. His voice was firm, though inside, a storm of doubts still raged. The principal looked up from his papers, surprised. Caleb told him in detail about the incident in the math class. When he finished, Mr. Wilson slowly nodded, his face serious. These are serious accusations, Caleb, he said, folding his hands on the desk. Are you sure you're ready for the consequences? Because by raising this issue, you'll face different opinions, and not all of them will be in your favor. Caleb thought for a moment. The question wasn't whether he was ready, but whether he could continue to stay silent. He realized that if he didn't speak up now, he would betray his principles. I'm sure, he said with a firmness that surprised even himself. It's unfair, and I can't stay silent anymore. The principal nodded again, seemingly respecting the student's determination. All right, Caleb, we'll hold a meeting to discuss this issue, but be prepared for resistance. Not everyone will agree with you. When Caleb left the office, he was filled with a sense of relief mixed with anxiety. He knew a difficult battle lay ahead, but the first step had been taken. He was no longer someone who stayed silent in the face of injustice. He was about to raise an issue that concerned not only him, but many others. And this was his fight, for truth, for justice, and for equality. A week had passed since the incident in the math class, but the wounds left in Caleb's soul by Mr. Riley were still fresh. He walked down the school corridor, trying to stay composed, but the feeling that everyone was staring at him was unbearable. The whispers behind his back, the stings of mockery from classmates who had once greeted him with smiles, now seemed louder than the sounds around him. Caleb knew he had become that guy, the one the teacher had publicly humiliated. It wasn't just a personal conflict. It had become a marker of how people treated someone like him. He had always believed that school was a place that taught fairness and justice, but now that illusion had been shattered. In the eyes of his classmates, he had become an outcast. The white students began avoiding him as if he were carrying a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. Even his friends, the few he could once talk to about anything, had distanced themselves. Caleb felt the cold grip of isolation tightening around him. His own thoughts had become unbearable. Every time he thought about what had happened, a wave of anger rose inside him. It hurt to realize that he had become the target of racist attacks, not only from adults, but also from his peers. His mind wandered between fear, resentment, and an unyielding desire to change something. But how? It seemed that the system he was in was designed to maintain injustice. On his way home, he noticed a group of kids from his class, quietly talking and smirking as they looked at him. He knew they were talking about him. Their stares burned into his back, but he kept walking without looking back. Inside, a conflict was growing. Should he fight this, or just let it be? The next morning, Caleb returned to school, feeling the same weight on his shoulders. As soon as he approached his locker, two of his classmates, who usually didn't pay him any attention, appeared beside him. Now they started speaking louder, as if deliberately wanting him to hear. "Did you see how Mr. Riley looked at that guy yesterday?" One of them snickered, nodding toward Caleb. "I wonder how he even passes his tests. Bet those privileges help." "Come on, maybe he's just lucky," added the other, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. Caleb felt something inside him snap. These weren't just jabs. They were expressions of deep-seated prejudice. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Clenching his fists and gritting his teeth, he turned to face them. "And what do you think?" he asked coldly, his voice filled with restrained fury. "What if I earn everything on my own?" The boys fell silent, exchanging glances, but one of them smirked and shrugged carelessly. "You know how it is," he said, grinning. "We all know." Those words cut him deeply, but now Caleb felt that silence was no longer an option. A storm of emotions raged inside him, and he realized that if he kept ignoring the injustice, it would only grow stronger. This realization became a turning point. He could no longer stand by and let it continue. "Well, if that's what you think, why don't you say it openly at the school assembly?" Caleb snapped back, feeling the tension rise. His classmates just laughed and walked away, leaving him standing alone. But now he knew he had to act. Late that evening, Caleb sat in his room, surrounded by textbooks and notebooks, but his thoughts were far from schoolwork. He couldn't shake the feeling of injustice that overwhelmed him every time he thought about what had happened. Silence was no longer an option. He realized that if no one stood up for those being humiliated, discrimination would continue to thrive. The next morning, Caleb approached the school principal, Mr. Wilson, and knocked on his office door. His heart was racing, but inside, his decision was firm. "Mr. Wilson," he began as he entered the office, "I need to talk to you. It's about the situation with Mr. Riley and what's been happening at the school." The principal nodded slowly, inviting him to sit down. He was a bit surprised, but quickly understood that the situation was serious. "I've noticed that racism here isn't limited to just one incident," Caleb continued, his voice steady, though he felt a slight tremor inside. "It's becoming a systemic problem, and I want to talk about it at the school assembly." Mr. Wilson sighed and leaned back in his chair. "This is a very serious step, Caleb. Are you sure you're ready for the consequences? Not everyone will support you. This will stir up discussions and possibly even conflict." Caleb understood that. He knew that many teachers and students wouldn't want to hear the truth, but he had no choice. "I'm ready," he said, looking the principal directly in the eye. "We can't stay silent any longer. If I don't take this step, nothing will change." The principal studied him closely, seeing the determination in Caleb's eyes. "All right," he finally said. "I'll arrange a meeting, and you'll have a chance to speak, but be prepared to defend your position to the end." As Caleb left the office, he was filled with a sense of relief mixed with anxiety. A tough battle lay ahead, but he had taken the first step. Now he understood that the fight for justice required determination and courage, and he was ready to go all the way. Caleb walked through the school hallway, feeling dozens of eyes on him. Ever since he brought up the issue of racism at the school assembly, the atmosphere around him had changed. He felt like an outcast among his peers. Friends who had once stood by his side now avoided him. Caleb constantly heard whispers behind his back, saw mocking smiles, and noticed the sideways glances from teachers. The sense of isolation grew stronger. He felt cut off from the school that had once been a safe place for him. Every morning became a test of will, finding the strength just to come here and continue his studies. But inside him, a fire still burned. A fire that told him he had done the right thing. Even if everyone around him had turned away, he knew his actions were necessary. As Caleb walked past a group of classmates, one of them called out loudly, "Hey Caleb, planning on going to another assembly? Maybe you can tell us how tough it is to be a victim." The laughter hit his ears like a loud slap. He gritted his teeth, trying not to show how much it hurt to hear that. He knew that reacting now would only give them more reason to mock him. But those words cut him deeply. It felt like all his efforts were only driving him further away from those who should have stood by him. As he walked further down the hall, a wave of despair washed over him. It seemed like his fight had lost its meaning, as if no one wanted to understand the seriousness of the issue he had tried to raise. Even the teachers, who he had hoped would support him, now looked at him with suspicion, as though he were the source of the problem. Later that day, after school, Caleb walked home slowly. His feet carried him along the familiar route, but this time he didn't feel the usual peace. He had no one to talk to. Even his friends, with whom he used to share all his thoughts, now avoided him. This loneliness was especially painful. Caleb tried to understand what had gone wrong. Why, when he had taken a stand for his rights and the rights of other black students, had his surroundings turned against him? When he got home, his mother greeted him with a smile, but she immediately sensed something was wrong. Caleb sat down at the table, placing his hands on his knees and taking a deep breath. "You look tired," she observed, sitting down across from him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with suppressed despair. "I don't know why I did it," he finally said. "It feels like everything's gotten worse. Now no one wants to talk to me, not even my friends. I feel like a stranger at school, where I used to be part of something. Maybe I made a mistake." His mother leaned forward, placing her hand on his. "You didn't make a mistake, Caleb. What you did took great courage, but you have to understand that fighting for truth and justice is rarely easy. Sometimes it leads to loneliness, but that doesn't mean you should give up. Your efforts matter, even if it's not visible right away." Caleb lowered his head, his thoughts swirling between fear and doubt. It was hard for him to accept this truth. He thought about those who had been by his side at the beginning and how they had turned away. It seemed like his fight for justice had pushed away everyone who had once been his support. The next day, Caleb sat in an empty classroom, preparing for the lesson, when Lisa, one of the few who hadn't turned away from him, approached him. "Caleb," she began softly, sitting down next to him in an empty chair. "I've seen how people look at you. It's unfair. You don't deserve to be treated like this." Caleb felt his heart soften a little at her words. He was surprised that someone still understood him. Lisa looked concerned, and in her eyes, he saw genuine sympathy. "Thank you," he whispered, "but it doesn't change the fact that most people have decided I'm the problem. I'm trying to fight for something bigger, and all they want is for everything to stay the same." Lisa looked at him intently. "I know, and I think a lot of them are just scared. They're afraid of change, afraid to talk about what they don't understand. But that doesn't mean you should give up. If you hadn't raised the issue, no one would have noticed the problem." Caleb thought about her words. She was right. Fear of change and the unwillingness to acknowledge injustice were what kept people on the sidelines. But his efforts had already sparked a reaction. Even if many didn't support him now, it didn't mean his actions didn't matter. "Are you ready to keep going?" Lisa asked, her eyes shining with determination. Caleb nodded. At that moment, he realized that his fight was just beginning, and even if he continued to feel lonely, he wasn't alone in his purpose. "Yes," he said firmly, "I won't give up." The fire within him reignited. It wasn't the fire of anger, but of resolve. He understood that the fight for justice rarely comes easily, and often requires the strength to stand firm, despite loneliness and resistance from those around him. But it was the only right path. Caleb sat at his desk in history class, staring blankly at the board. His mind was filled with thoughts about his recent conversation with the principal and the reactions of his classmates. The loneliness and misunderstanding grew stronger every day. He felt trapped in a cocoon, unable to break free without destroying everything around him. However, today, something was different. His history teacher, Mr. Jenkins, had asked him to stay after class. When the bell rang and the students began leaving, Mr. Jenkins motioned for Caleb to come closer. "Caleb, I know things haven't been easy for you lately," he began in a soft but firm voice. I see that you're trying to fight for what you believe in, and I respect that. But I also understand how hard it is to be the only one willing to go against the system." These words immediately caught Caleb's attention. Up until now, he had thought none of the teachers saw his efforts, and if they did, they chose to ignore them. Now he felt that Mr. Jenkins understood his pain. "I wanted to suggest something," the teacher continued. "We could organize a discussion about this issue during history class. It would be a chance for everyone to speak and listen to each other. What do you think?" At first, Caleb was taken aback. The thought of raising such an important topic in front of the entire class seemed terrifying, but he understood that this was an opportunity to make real progress. I'm not sure," Caleb hesitated. "Do you think they'll want to listen?" "They might not," Mr. Jenkins admitted. "But if we don't try, we'll never know. Besides, I'll be there to help. The most important thing is to create a space for dialogue." Caleb nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite inside him. Maybe all wasn't lost. Maybe he would find support in those still willing to listen. At the next history lesson, Mr. Jenkins kept his promise. He began the class by announcing that they would be discussing racism and inequality at school. The classroom was instantly filled with tension. Some students immediately expressed their displeasure, whispering among themselves. Caleb, sitting in his seat, felt his heart race. He knew he would have to speak, and he understood that the reactions could be mixed. "Today, we're going to talk about how issues of racism affect our society, and specifically, our school," Mr. Jenkins began. "Caleb has kindly agreed to share his experience, and I hope we can have an open and honest conversation." Caleb felt the eyes of his classmates on him. Some looked curious, others openly irritated. He took a deep breath and stood up. "I know many of you think this isn't that big of a problem," he began, trying to sound confident, though inside he was trembling. "But for me and other black students at our school, this is a part of daily life. Every day we face bias, doubts about our abilities, just because of how we look." Caleb felt a lump rise in his throat, but he continued. He spoke about the incident with Mr. Riley, how his friends had turned away from him, and how he had become an outcast simply for bringing up the issue of fairness. "I'm not asking for pity," he said at the end. "I just want you to understand that this problem is real, and if we don't talk about it, it will only get worse." After he finished speaking, the classroom fell into silence. No one had expected such a candid revelation. Some students looked uncomfortable, others annoyed. Finally, one of them spoke up. "I don't think this is a problem for everyone," said Tom, one of his classmates. "Maybe you're just taking things too seriously." Those words stung, but Caleb was ready for them. "It might not be a problem for you," he replied calmly. "But for me and others, it's a reality. Just because you don't see the problem doesn't mean it doesn't exist." The lesson continued, and soon other students began speaking up. Some openly expressed support for Caleb. One of them, Mia, raised her hand and said, "I never thought about it that way, but now that Caleb has shared his story, I realize I've been ignoring a lot. It really is unfair." Those words were like balm for Caleb's soul. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone had truly listened. It was a small but significant recognition of the truth he had been trying to convey. He felt that his efforts weren't in vain. Mr. Jenkins wrapped up the lesson. "I think today we've taken an important step. Understanding each other's problems is the first step towards solving them. Thank you, Caleb, for your courage." When the class ended, Caleb stayed behind a little longer to thank Mr. Jenkins. "Thank you," he said quietly after everyone had left. "I didn't think anyone would support me." Mr. Jenkins smiled. "You've done something important, Caleb, and you'll see that support will come from places you least expect. Just keep moving forward." Caleb nodded, feeling a sense of relief and inner strength. That day gave him hope that, despite all the obstacles, he wasn't alone in his fight. Caleb sat at his desk, staring at his phone screen, where the notification icon glowed. It wasn't until he saw the number of views and comments under the video that his classmate had posted that he realized his story had gone public. This was a moment he hadn't anticipated, but now the situation was spiraling beyond the school's walls. The video of the assembly, where Caleb spoke about the issue of racism at school, had spread across social media at lightning speed. People in the comments expressed their opinions. Some supported him, while others criticized him. But most importantly, he was no longer alone in this fight. His voice was being heard beyond the confines of the school. Caleb felt a mix of emotions: relief that his story was out, but also fear of what would come next. He knew the school wouldn't let this go unnoticed, and the looming threat of punishment hung over him. His mother, having seen the news, came over, sat beside him, and looked him straight in the eye. "Do you understand what this means, Caleb?" she asked gently. Caleb nodded, still staring at the screen. "I understand, but this was the only way. No one was listening to me in school. Now they'll have to." His mother sighed, clearly worried but understanding her son. Caleb had already made up his mind and was prepared for the consequences. He felt that if the administration wouldn't hear him directly, then public opinion would be his ally. The next day when Caleb arrived at school, the atmosphere was different. He immediately noticed the tense looks from the teachers, the whispers of his classmates, and the special attention from the administration. He knew that the video had become a catalyst for events that could quickly spiral out of control. The school was under public pressure, and the administration wasn't going to sit idly by. In history class, Mr. Jenkins, who had previously supported Caleb, was noticeably more reserved. The teacher was careful, observing the mood in the class, and Caleb realized that even those who had once stood by him might not withstand the mounting pressure. After class, Caleb was summoned to the principal's office. The room felt unusually cold as he stepped inside. He knew that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Caleb," the principal began, "I know you're aware of how your story has spread online. We're in a difficult situation. The school can't ignore this kind of attention, but we also can't allow you to continue like this." Caleb felt the tension in his chest tighten. His actions had put the school's reputation at risk, and it was clear that the principal was not on his side. "We will take measures to regain control of the situation, and if you continue, the consequences will be severe," the principal continued, his tone cold and unyielding. "I can't just stay silent," Caleb responded, his voice firm despite his fear. "This isn't just about me. I'm fighting for those who face this issue every day." "Fighting for justice doesn't give you the right to undermine the authority of the school," the principal cut in sharply. Caleb realized he was at a tipping point. His actions had drawn attention, but also placed him at the center of a conflict with the system. Now he had to decide how to proceed. Seeing that the school intended to suppress his efforts, Caleb made his decision. He knew silence was no longer an option. Together with Lisa and a few other students who supported him, they organized a peaceful protest. Caleb understood it was a risky move, but he also knew that real change often required sacrifice. They gathered in the schoolyard with signs bearing messages of justice and equality. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest with each step toward the center of the yard. Students who had been watching began to approach, some to support, others just to observe. "We are here to say that racism and injustice can no longer go unnoticed," Caleb called out to the crowd. "We deserve equal rights and respect, regardless of the color of our skin." His voice was confident, but inside, emotions swirled. He knew the administration wouldn't let this go, but his support was growing day by day. Within minutes, school administrators approached the protesters, their faces tense as they demanded the demonstration end. Caleb stood at the center, his gaze locked on the school officials. He had no intention of backing down. "We have the right to a peaceful protest," he said firmly, "and we won't leave until our voices are heard." Silence fell over the yard. Caleb's heart raced, and he knew the moment of truth had arrived. He had chosen this path, and now there was no turning back. He understood that the fight for justice often required public pressure, and now that moment had come. Caleb sat in the kitchen, his fingers nervously tapping on the table. A few days had passed since the peaceful protest, and the school hadn't remained silent. He had been informed that he was temporarily suspended for destabilizing the environment. Though he had expected the school to react, the news still hit him hard. A heavy feeling of anger, helplessness, and deep disappointment grew in his chest. They had decided to punish him for trying to bring attention to systemic injustice. As he sat there, he reflected on how things had escalated. It seemed his fight for justice had only heightened tensions rather than fostering understanding. Caleb's mother, noticing his downcast mood, sat beside him and gently spoke. "I know it's hard, son, but this path is rarely easy. You knew they might react this way." Caleb pressed his lips together, feeling the bitterness rising inside him. "I knew," he said quietly, "but I didn't think it would be like this. I tried to change something, and all they want is to silence me." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze filled with care. "You did the right thing, and we will keep fighting. This isn't the end." Her words ignited a small spark of hope in Caleb. He knew he couldn't give up, even if the world around him felt unfair and hostile. He had to keep pushing forward. The next day, Caleb and his family met with a lawyer to discuss the legal side of the situation. The lawyer, Ms. Wilson, was an experienced human rights attorney and quickly took on the case, recognizing the clear violation of Caleb's rights. "A temporary suspension for participating in a peaceful protest is a direct attack on your constitutional rights," she began, spreading documents across the table. "We can file a lawsuit against the school for violating your right to free speech and assembly." Caleb listened to her, trying to process everything that was happening. He had never imagined his fight for justice would lead to a legal battle, but now this was his reality. "Are you prepared for the fact that this process could take a long time?" Ms. Wilson asked, looking at Caleb closely. "The school will defend itself, and they might use every resource to discredit you." Caleb nodded, feeling his resolve strengthen. "I'm ready. If that's what it takes to get the truth, then I'll fight." His mother, sitting beside him, had a look of mixed pride and worry on her face. She understood that their family was now involved in something much bigger than just a school conflict. "We'll support you," she said, squeezing her son's hand. "You're not alone in this fight." From that moment, the situation took on a more serious tone. This was no longer just a school dispute. It had become a matter of legality and justice on a societal level. Caleb understood that his case would gain media attention, and he had to be ready for it to reach a national level. Weeks passed, and the story of Caleb's suspension became a widely discussed topic in both local and national news. The media began covering his story, and it sparked a storm of debate. Some people supported him, calling his actions brave and necessary in the fight against racism in schools. Others criticized him, arguing that he had broken school discipline and undermined the system. Caleb sat in front of the television, listening to reporters discuss his case. It was a strange feeling, seeing himself on screen, his name and story becoming the subject of national discourse. He wasn't sure what to feel, fear that things had gone too far, or pride that his fight had gained so much attention. "This has become bigger than I thought," he admitted to his mother, who was sitting next to him. "It was meant to become something bigger," she replied. "You're fighting not just for yourself, but for many others who face the same issue, and now the whole world sees it." Caleb took a deep breath, realizing the magnitude of the situation. He understood that his fight had grown beyond his personal struggles. It was now a fight for justice for everyone who faced systemic racism and injustice in education. When Ms. Wilson announced that the lawsuit had been filed and the school was now required to answer for its actions, Caleb felt a new wave of determination surge within him. "We'll fight this to the end," he said. "I won't let them just sweep this under the rug." His mother looked at him with pride in her eyes. "You've already won, Caleb. You gave a voice to those who didn't have one, and that's the most important thing." Caleb now understood that his fight had become part of a larger societal struggle. He no longer saw it as just his personal battle. It was a fight for all those who faced injustice and oppression, and he was ready to keep going. Caleb sat in his room, staring at his phone as it vibrated endlessly with new messages and notifications. Ever since the media began covering his story, the support had grown like a snowball. Local activists, human rights organizations, and parents of other students all expressed their solidarity. Caleb felt both relieved and anxious. His case was no longer just about him. It had become part of a broader conversation. But with the support came immense pressure. He thought about his family, now under the public's eye as well. The calls, letters, and messages of support were mixed with threats and accusations. People who resisted change were voicing their displeasure, blaming him for all the issues the school had faced in recent weeks. "How are you doing?" his mother asked, peeking into his room, her eyes full of concern. Caleb sighed deeply. "I don't know. I'm glad we're getting support, but I feel like there's pressure coming at us from all sides," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Sometimes it feels like this has all gotten out of control." His mother sat down next to him, her gaze steady and reassuring. "Change scares people, especially those who aren't ready for it. But you're not alone in this. We're all with you. We'll fight together, no matter what happens." Caleb knew she was right, but fear continued to grow inside him. It felt like the more attention his story received, the more people were out to stop him. The next day, the pressure on Caleb's family escalated. As they walked into a local store, several people whispered and looked at them with disdain. Some even approached and openly expressed their displeasure. "You're ruining our school," one woman shouted near the checkout. "Because of you, the kids are suffering." The words hit Caleb like a punch. He had expected resistance, but he didn't think it would be so blatant and hostile. His mother gave the woman a restrained smile, refusing to engage, but Caleb felt anger boiling inside him. When they returned home, his father, who had mostly stayed out of the conflict, sat down to talk with him. "Son, I know this isn't easy," his father began, trying to remain calm. "But you have to remember that you're fighting for the right cause. These people are angry because they're afraid of change. Don't let them break you." Caleb nodded silently, but the inner conflict continued to grow. He understood that these people weren't ready to face the truth, but how long could he endure this pressure? That evening, he received a message from a local human rights organization offering to help organize a rally in his support. "This could be your chance to show that you're not alone," Lisa said the next day at school when they discussed it. "You should take their help." Caleb thought about it. A rally was a serious step, and he knew it would draw even more attention, both positive and negative. But he also realized that it was an opportunity to strengthen his stance and show that his fight wasn't just a personal grievance. It was a systemic issue that needed addressing. The day of the rally arrived. Caleb stood on stage, looking out at the gathered crowd. The turnout was larger than he had anticipated. Local activists, parents, human rights advocates, all were there to support his cause. He felt a mix of overwhelming nervousness and growing confidence. He now knew that his struggle wasn't just a personal journey, but part of a larger social battle for equality and justice. Today, we are here to say one thing. The system must change, he began, his voice firm and resolute. We can no longer stay silent in the face of injustice. Our school is just the beginning. We need to change not only it, but the entire system that supports racism and inequality. The crowd responded with cheers of approval. Caleb felt his words resonate with the people in front of him. This was the moment he had been working toward from the beginning, the chance to be heard and supported. Now his fight had become a public issue. The activists who had helped organize the rally took the stage after him, emphasizing the importance of continuing this fight at all levels. The media once again began covering the event, and Caleb realized that this day would mark a significant step toward real change. As the rally came to a close and people began to disperse, Caleb stayed behind, gazing at the now empty stage. His mother walked up to him, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "You did it," she said with pride. "This is just the beginning," he replied softly, knowing there was still a long road ahead. But now he had support. He was no longer alone in his fight. Caleb sat in his room, reflecting on the aftermath of the rally. Over the past few days, the situation at school had shifted. The protests, rallies, and media attention had drawn the scrutiny of government agencies. His fight had become more serious than ever. But with that came new pressures. He began to notice that some teachers and students were growing increasingly resentful of him. The atmosphere in school was tense, as if everyone was waiting for his next move to trigger another conflict. Every morning, as Caleb walked down the hallway, he felt the stares. Some students supported him in silence, while others openly showed their displeasure. His once normal school life had turned into a political battleground, and it felt like every step he took was being scrutinized. Deep down, Caleb felt doubts creeping in. He began to question whether continuing the fight was worth it. His actions were causing so much negativity and discontent. The exhaustion within him was building, and the fear of potential consequences was eating away at his resolve. One evening, he sat down with his mother. "I feel like this is spiraling out of control," he confessed, lowering his gaze. "The school hates me. The teachers. They don't see me as a student anymore. I don't know if I should keep going." His mother gently touched his shoulder. "You can't give up, Caleb. You did what many were afraid to do. Now, you need to be strong. Change always meets resistance, but you have to see this through to the end." Her words made Caleb think. He knew she was right, but could he withstand the pressure? The next day, the school announced an official investigation. The news reported that government agencies had decided to intervene, aiming to address the allegations of racism and injustice. This was a victory for Caleb, but it also stirred more resentment among teachers and students. In math class, taught by Mr. Riley, the teacher who had sparked Caleb's battle, tension filled the room. Mr. Riley spoke with obvious irritation, making veiled comments about the situation that had brought so much attention to the school. "Some people think they can tear down the entire system for their personal interests," Mr. Riley said, without naming Caleb directly, though everyone knew who he was referring to. "But let's not forget that school is a place for learning, not for political games." The words stung Caleb. He clenched his jaw, feeling a wave of anger and frustration rise inside him. He wanted to argue, to say that this wasn't a game, but a fight for justice. yet he knew that anything he said could be used against him. After class, one of the students, Tom, who had previously been neutral, approached him with clear irritation. "Do you really think you're doing something useful, Caleb?" he asked with a sneer. "Because of you, everyone is suffering. The school can't function properly anymore, and it's all because of your protests. Maybe it's time to stop." Those words struck a nerve. Caleb knew he was fighting for what was right, but he also saw the negative impact his actions were having on others. The internal conflict tore at him. Was it worth continuing if his fight was causing so much pain for those around him? That evening, Caleb spent hours in deep thought. He felt his doubts eating away at his determination. On one hand, he had started this fight for justice and equality, but now it seemed like his actions were only leading to disappointment and chaos. He felt himself teetering on the edge of giving up, but the next day, everything changed. When Caleb arrived at school, no one approached him with support. In fact, the tension around him had grown even stronger. There were no smiles or greetings. Many of his classmates avoided eye contact, as if his presence made them uncomfortable. Yet, despite this, a renewed sense of determination ignited within Caleb. At that moment, he realized that even if people had turned away from him, it didn't invalidate the righteousness of his cause. He stood at a crossroads, to retreat and let the system win, or to push forward, despite the mounting pressure. Caleb knew that many stayed silent, not because they disagreed with him, but because they were afraid of the consequences. He couldn't let fear stop him. That evening, before an important school assembly, Caleb spoke with his mother. "I've realized something. Change doesn't come easily, and if I give up now, nothing will ever change. I'm going to see this through to the end." His mother looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're making the right choice, Caleb, and even though it won't be easy, I'll always be with you." With those words, Caleb felt his internal conflict begin to subside. He had made his decision. His fight was no longer limited to one school or one teacher. It had become something much bigger, a fight for justice for everyone who had faced injustice and oppression. When the school principal announced the upcoming assembly to discuss the investigation, Caleb knew he would have to speak again. Inside, he still carried fear and doubt, but now he was ready to face them. As he stepped onto the stage in the auditorium, he felt the weight of his classmates' and teachers' stares, but with that came a sense of responsibility. Caleb knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to continue his fight for justice. Caleb stood by his locker at school, feeling the weight of his classmates' stares pressing down on him. The dissatisfaction was no longer hidden. A few weeks ago, his story and the rally had drawn attention from all who cared about racism and social injustice. But now, the situation was boiling over. Caleb began to notice rumors spreading about his intentions and personal life. The words moved through the halls like venomous whispers. "Caleb is just doing this for attention. He just wants to be famous. It's all about the money." Although these statements weren't said directly to him, they struck hard. He felt the distrust and hostility closing in. Even those who had once supported him were now drifting away. "Do they really think I'm doing this for myself?" Caleb thought as he walked past a group of students smirking at him. These thoughts gnawed at him. He couldn't find peace anymore, even knowing his fight was for justice. The constant doubts of others began to infect his own view of his cause. When Caleb came home, his mother saw the strain on his face. "Something's bothering you," she said softly, sitting down beside him on the couch. "What's going on?" Caleb remained silent for a while, searching for the right words. "People, they're talking behind my back, spreading rumors. Even my friends are looking at me differently now. Maybe they think I'm doing this for myself." His mother leaned in, her eyes filled with calm and understanding. "In any fight for truth and justice, there will always be those who question your motives," she said. "They're afraid of change, afraid of what you represent." But her words didn't immediately ease Caleb's pain. Inside him, a conflict was growing. Should he keep going, knowing that even those closest to him were starting to doubt? The next day, Caleb experienced an even greater shock. His best friend, Mark, who he had known since childhood, stopped talking to him. This hit him hard. He saw Mark sitting at a table in the cafeteria with other students, deliberately avoiding his gaze. When Caleb tried to approach, Mark turned away, pretending not to see him. Caleb couldn't understand it. Mark had always been there for him during tough times. They had talked about everything, from school problems to future dreams. And now, this person had suddenly disappeared from his life. Finally, Caleb gathered the courage to confront him after school. "Mark, are you avoiding me?" Caleb asked, feeling the tension rising in his chest. Mark looked at him, and in his eyes, Caleb saw a mix of guilt and uncertainty. I can't be a part of this anymore," Mark said, glancing away. "I don't want it to affect me. People are starting to think I'm involved too." "Involved in what?" Caleb's voice trembled with frustration. "In fighting for justice?" Mark simply shook his head. "It's not that simple, Caleb. Now everyone thinks you're doing this for yourself, and I don't want to be part of that." Those words cut Caleb deeply. He hadn't expected even his close friends to turn their backs on him so quickly. This moment became a turning point for him. He realized that his fight had cost him old connections, and now he had to continue alone. That night, as Caleb sat in his room, overwhelmed by the realization of how quickly he had lost support, the silence was shattered by a loud crash. The explosive sound came from outside. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. In the dim light of the street lamps, he saw someone throw a rock through their house's window, then quickly vanish into the darkness. Caleb felt his heart pound with fear and anger. He ran outside, but the attackers were already gone. His mother and father, hearing the noise, ran after him. "It was them," Caleb said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "The people who want me to stop." His mother hugged him tightly, her face filled with deep concern. "They're scared, and all they have is hate and fear," she said. "But they can't break you, Caleb." That night marked a turning point for Caleb. He realized that his fight had moved beyond the walls of the school and had become a personal conflict that now threatened not just him, but his family. He understood that this was a test of his strength and principles. "They want me to be afraid," he told himself as he looked at the shattered window. "But I won't back down. If I give up now, everything I've fought for will be for nothing." The next morning, Caleb walked into school with renewed resolve. Despite the fear, the hostility, the threats, and the loss of friends, he knew he couldn't stop. To retreat would mean betraying his principles and those who believed in his cause. Caleb stood firm, knowing that his fight for justice was more important than the sacrifices it demanded. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window. The day of the hearing was approaching fast, and every thought about it made his heart race. For the first time, the school administration had agreed to address the issue of systemic racism. The public pressure, rallies, and media coverage had finally paid off. But now, the weight of responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. His story was at the center of it all. People were waiting for his speech, waiting to hear his words. But behind all the anticipation, there was fear. What if I can't do it? That question haunted him. He knew he wouldn't get a second chance. His voice needed to be clear, his words powerful, to make the listeners stop and think. His mother knocked gently on the door, her voice soft but filled with concern. "Are you ready?" she asked, sitting beside him. Caleb sighed and ran a hand over his face. "I think so, but it's not easy. Every time I think about what I have to say, I feel like I'm carrying the weight of everyone who's ever gone through this. It's more than just telling my story. It's like I'm speaking for all of us." His mother nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You've always spoken from the heart, Caleb. That's your strength. You're not afraid of the truth, and people see that." Her words brought him some comfort. He knew his speech was important, but the fear still lingered. He knew this was the moment of truth. The hall was packed. Teachers, students, parents, and community members had all come to the public hearing to hear what Caleb had to say. The school administration sat in the front row, their faces stern but tense. Among the students, Caleb could see the same mixture of emotions, some curious, others openly hostile. It was hard for him to separate himself from all those emotions, but he knew that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what he would say. When they called him to the microphone, Caleb felt his legs grow heavy. But as he reached the podium, he took a deep breath, pulling all his thoughts and emotions into focus. "I'm here to speak not just about myself," he began, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger. "I'm here to talk about how systemic racism affects all of us, students, teachers, our community." He shared his story, starting with the incident involving Mr. Riley, when his abilities were questioned because of the color of his skin. But he didn't stop there. Caleb spoke about every moment he had felt like an outcast, about how his friends had turned away, how the entire school had started treating him like he was the enemy. "I didn't fight because I wanted attention or fame," he continued. "I fought because I couldn't take it anymore. I know many of you have felt the same but haven't spoken up. But I couldn't stay silent." With every word, the room grew quieter. Even those who had opposed him listened closely. Caleb could see that his words were resonating. He wasn't just telling his story. He was telling the stories of everyone who had faced injustice. "We can't let racism go unnoticed. We can't let anyone here feel like they don't belong because they're different. We have to start with our school. This is our home, and if we don't make it fair, who will?" His voice trembled as he finished his speech. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no going back now. He had said everything he needed to say. After Caleb spoke, there was a long, tense silence. No one seemed to know what to say. But then, unexpectedly, one of the teachers stood up and started clapping. It was Mr. Jenkins, the history teacher who had supported Caleb by organizing a classroom discussion earlier. His applause was slow but powerful, and gradually others began to join in. Caleb was stunned. He hadn't expected this level of support, especially in that room. Students who had once doubted him started clapping. Even those who had been against him couldn't ignore his courage and sincerity. "You're right, Caleb," Mr. Jenkins said as he approached the microphone. "Our home needs to be fair, and you've helped us see that." Those words sparked even more excitement in the room. Caleb felt tears welling up in his eyes. He realized that his voice had finally been heard. He no longer had to fight alone. Now he had allies, and his battle for justice had become part of something much larger. The school administration, seeing the overwhelming support, was forced to acknowledge that they could no longer ignore the problem. They promised to conduct an internal investigation and take steps to ensure that racism would no longer go unnoticed within the school. As Caleb walked out of the hall, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. This wasn't just the end of a difficult chapter in his life. It was the first step toward real change. Caleb sat in class, unable to focus on the teacher's words. His mind was consumed by the recent news. Mr. Riley, The teacher who had openly discriminated against him at the start of all this had filed for resignation. Caleb didn't know how to feel. It seemed like a victory, yet there was a strange emptiness attached to it. He knew this wasn't the solution to all the problems, but still, there was a sense of relief. He's gone, but this isn't the end, Caleb thought, realizing that the teacher's resignation wouldn't change the system that allowed such behavior to exist in the first place. His fight had never been against one person, but against an ingrained mindset. However, this moment offered him a glimmer of hope. After class, Lisa approached him. "Did you hear?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Riley's leaving. We did it." Caleb nodded, but couldn't bring himself to smile. He felt like he should be happy, but a heavy weight remained inside him. "It's not over yet," he said quietly, and Lisa frowned. "You're right, but it's a big step," she replied. "We need to keep moving forward." Those words made Caleb reflect. He understood that the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint. One resignation wouldn't change a system that had ignored racism for so long, but it was the first tangible result, and it needed to be a foundation for further action. A few weeks later, the school officially announced the formation of a commission on racial inequality. Many saw this as a sign of acknowledgement, but Caleb knew it wasn't enough. He attended the first meeting of the commission, where plans for reforms were discussed. It didn't take long for him to notice how the teachers and administrators were trying to soften the edges, avoiding truly difficult issues. The meeting included members of the administration, teachers, a few parents, and students. Caleb was there as a voice for those who had experienced injustice. "We need to make sure the school is a safe and fair place for everyone," one of the teachers said. But to Caleb, it sounded like an empty statement. When it was Caleb's turn to speak, he stood up and looked at those gathered. He felt the weight of their gazes, but inside him, anger was bubbling. "I appreciate that the school is finally addressing these issues," he began, his voice firm. "But we can't ignore the fact that these problems have existed for years. We don't just need a commission. We need real actions that will change the culture of our school." The commission listened, but Caleb knew that many still weren't ready for deep change. For some, this was just a formality, a way to show the public that something was being done. After the meeting, several students approached Caleb and thanked him for his courage. They told him how his fight had inspired them. To them, he had become a symbol of the fight for justice. But this role only added to the weight on Caleb's shoulders. "I can't let them down," he told himself as he walked home. "I have to keep going." Despite the visible successes, the resignation of Mr. Riley, and the formation of the commission, Caleb knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. Every day at school reminded him of how much work was still needed. Some teachers still looked at him with suspicion, and some students avoided him. He hadn't expected things to change overnight, but a sense of anxiety grew inside him. He understood that the fight for justice was an ongoing process. It wasn't a moment or a single victory, but a long struggle to change people's minds. He knew he had to be ready for more challenges, to keep proving his point again and again. One evening, Caleb sat in his room, thinking about what was next. His mother knocked on the door and, entering, sat beside him. "You look tired," she said softly, looking at him with concern. "But I know you won't give up." Caleb looked at her, his face tense. "I just don't know if I have the strength. It feels like I've only just started, and there's already been so much fighting, and it never seems to end." His mother wrapped her arms around him, her voice quiet but full of certainty. "Change always comes with struggle. But you've already done so much. You've shown everyone that change is possible. And now, you're not alone." Her words sank deep into his heart. Caleb realized that his fight had inspired not only himself, but others as well. He was no longer alone in his pursuit of justice. He had allies now, and together they could achieve more. The next day, he returned to school with renewed determination. He now knew that every step he took was a step toward the change that was needed, not just for him, but for everyone who had faced injustice. And he was ready to walk that path until the end. Caleb sat at the long table in the principal's office, surrounded by members of the school board. A few months ago, he never could have imagined himself here, participating in discussions about new school policies. His journey had been long and difficult, filled with struggles and doubts, but now he felt like part of something bigger. After his speeches and protests, the school had begun to change. The Racial Equality Commission was already in place, and now Caleb had become the leader of the student council. But with this new status came a new burden of responsibility. He could no longer be just a student fighting for justice. Now people expected decisions, actions, and compromises from him. Caleb knew that his words carried weight, but they could also bring negative consequences. Inside, he struggled with how to remain true to his principles while leading a group that wasn't always ready to accept his views. When the meeting ended, Lisa approached him, her face full of enthusiasm. "You're doing great, Caleb," she said with a smile. "You've always known how to get your point across. Now you're not just a voice, you're a leader." But Caleb couldn't hide his inner anxiety. "It's harder than I thought," he admitted. "Before, I was just fighting for justice. Now I have to make decisions that not everyone agrees with. Sometimes I feel like I have to make compromises to keep things moving, and that scares me." Lisa looked at him seriously. "Change always comes with tough choices, but you've already shown that you can fight for the right cause. Now you have to learn how to do it on a new level." One morning, Caleb received an unexpected letter, an offer for a scholarship to a prestigious school in another city. It was a chance to receive a better education, to escape the tension at his current school, and to start fresh. The scholarship promised incredible opportunities, and his family was excited for him. But inside Caleb, a complex conflict unfolded. He sat at his desk, staring at the letter, but he couldn't focus on its contents. His thoughts jumped from one idea to another. On the one hand, he deserved this opportunity. The scholarship could change his life, giving him more resources and knowledge to continue fighting injustice. But on the other hand, leaving his school now felt like giving up. Change had only just begun, and he was part of it. Leaving would mean abandoning the fight halfway. At dinner, he told his parents about the offer. His mother was full of pride, her face glowing with joy. "This is an amazing opportunity, Caleb. You'll be able to achieve even more," she said, leaning toward him. But his father, usually quiet, looked at him thoughtfully. "It's a big chance for sure," he finally said. "But you have to decide what you want. This is your life, and you need to understand what matters most to you." Caleb remained silent. He had to make a choice, leave and take advantage of the opportunity, or stay and continue his fight in the school he had already begun to change. The next morning, Caleb made his decision. He chose to stay. He realized that his presence at the school mattered not only for himself, but also for those who had supported him. He had become a symbol of change, and if he left now, those who looked to him with hope might lose their faith. "I can't just walk away," he told Lisa as they sat on the steps in front of the school. "Sure, I could get a great education, but who's going to stay here and continue the fight? We've only just started to change the system. I can't leave it behind." Lisa smiled, her eyes shining with approval. "I knew you'd make that choice. That's what makes you strong, Caleb. You never take the easy way out." Caleb felt confident that he had made the right decision. He looked at the school, which had once felt foreign and hostile. Now it was a symbol of his fight, but he knew there was still much work ahead. The school reforms were only just beginning, and he would be the one to guide them. He understood that his path would be difficult, that new challenges and obstacles would arise, but now he felt stronger than ever. He knew that his efforts could lead to real change, not just at the school, but in society. And though he had chosen to stay, Caleb knew this was only the beginning of his journey towards something greater. He would continue his fight for justice, and he was ready to go all the way.